Watchmen is influential, ambitious, and complex. Summing it up in one video is next to impossible, so this is a brief review situated almost exclusively in my personal experience with the graphic novel. There may be mild spoilers in this review, no more though than you might receive from casually flipping through a graphic novel at random in a store. If this bothers you, you have been warned. Otherwise, keep on watching for my view on one of the most complex graphic novels I've ever come across. The first time I saw Watchmen was in someone else's hands on the bus going to my high school. They were sitting ahead of me and reading some pages from this chapter. I can't remember the exact pages, but I'm quite sure this was the chapter. I couldn't make heads or tails of it without any other context, and the way it seemed to flit between different characters and time periods was utterly confusing. Despite this, when the boy ahead of me closed the book and I saw the bold black and yellow cover, it left an impression on me, and after stumbling across it in a bookstore years later, I decided to buy it. At this time, reading was probably the thing I did most. More than sleeping even. So the next morning, I began to read it immediately. Straight away, I was sucked into a dark and gritty world that was such a strong contrast to the light adventures I'd come to expect of comics from my limited readings of ancient issues of the Phantom. The first few pages started with a murder and a dramatic sequence of panels that can only be described as cinematic, the camera, as it were, zooming out to reveal the window the comedian had fallen from. This cinematic quality pervades the novel and has to be one of the reasons I was so disappointed with the Zack Snyder adaptation. The visuals were already cinematic enough that translation into a film felt pointless, and all that Snyder managed to achieve was an overall dumbed-down story, a story that lacked the depth the novel had in every aspect. For full disclosure, I actually hated the film and what it did to the comic. The idea it could start from such a strong narrative and visual base and end up as a fairly standard action film was astonishingly disappointing. But hey, I'm not talking about the film here. So what's the big deal with the source material? Why is it so revered? I can't answer as to why it seems to be almost universally loved, but I can describe why it is that I love it as much as I do. In the opening lines to this video, I describe Watchmen as complex, by which I refer to the complexity of the characters, not the plot or the art, although both are certainly very enjoyable as well. And it is because of the complex characters that I love Watchmen as much as I do. It's not just the main characters that are fleshed out and complex either. Minor characters are celebrated and explored in Watchmen perhaps more than in any other book, movie, game or TV show I've come across. And because of the close and constant attention to detail with which Moore writes for his characters, every action, both on an individual basis and as part of the grander plot, feels natural, despite the sometimes absurd conclusions different character arcs reach. When I first read Watchmen, I read it largely from the perspective of the first costume vigilante to be introduced. I read it from Rorschach's perspective, one of clearly delineated black and white morality in a story that almost exclusively deals with the shades in between. Perhaps this was because I was young and the angsty dialogue and disturbed morality seemed cool, or perhaps it was for the excellent design of Rorschach with his ever-changing mask that I saw him as the central character. Or perhaps it was just for the simple fact that his narration was the first introduction to the world of Watchmen. But for whatever reason, Rorschach was the main character upon my first reading. On my subsequent readings, however, different characters caught my attention each time. Whether it was the detached and almost omniscient perspective of Dr. Manhattan, or the self-involved and somewhat lonely perspective of Night Owl 2, each character can be read to be the central character, and the story seems very different from Silk Spectre 2's perspective to Ozymandias's. I've lost count of the times I've read Watchmen, but it would probably be in the double digits now, and every time was different. Every time I read the novel from another character's perspective. Even the minor supporting characters like the news vendor or the cab driver have enough of a personal stake and a different experience throughout the book that their perspectives are equally valid ways to read the novel. This depth in the writing of the characters is backed up by the quality of the art. Moore's writing and Gibbons' line work complement each other wonderfully, and Moore often has enough trust in Gibbons to allow for whole pages to pass without any dialogue at all, to wonderful effect. Gibbons' artwork speaks for itself. While Moore's writing isn't so immediately brilliant on first glance, or indeed first description, Gibbons' art is, and I'll let you make up your own mind from these select panels. Watchmen is wonderfully written and drawn, but alone the writing and the artwork wouldn't be the literary milestones some see Watchmen as. The graphic novel is far more than the sum of its parts, and to me represents the best synergy between the artist and writer I've come across, with the obvious exception of comics or graphic novels that are written and drawn by the same person. Each panel and each speech bubble perfectly complement each other. So what do you think? Is Watchmen too pretentious and slow to be enjoyable? Or is it a perfectly paced masterpiece representing the very best the medium has to offer? Let me know in the comments below. Before you go, I'd love to know what you'd like me to cover next. A game, a movie, a TV show, or a book? If you have a preference, chuck it in the comments below. The next video is already planned, but the one after that could change based on what you ask for. Cheers, have a good one. Killing and Dying, a collection of 6 short stories, is full of beautiful and sad denouements. Everyday life presented in a way that's beautiful and tragic at the same time. Covering a wide variety of styles, Adrian Tamim's work